Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to Clim Auditorium. Welcome to our inaugural lecture of the 2024 spring semester. It's really a joy to see everyone here, packing the house, and excited to get things started tonight. Before we begin, I'd like to share a land acknowledgement. The indigenous creation myth of Turtle Island describes an assortment of species working together to build a continental landmass on the back of Turtle in order to create a place for Skywoman to touch down as she falls from Skyworld. We wish to invoke this collective act of world building as one aspect of our acknowledgement that we sit on the stolen lands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Wea, Miami, Mascoutin, Odawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. This is a starting point and a place from which to invent new stories for the new worlds that we will build together as we collectively and individually decolonize and unsettle ourselves. Good evening again. For those of you who may not know me, my name is Joseph Altruller. I'm an assistant professor here at the Illinois School of Architecture and chair of the Lecture and Exhibition Committee. And it is my deep pleasure to welcome you to tonight's event. This semester, our curated series is entitled Building Affinities. Affinities connotes a natural attraction to a person, thing, or idea. This lecture series explores the intimate attractions among architecture, people, and the expanded environment. What affinities might we have for our buildings, and how can we build new affinities and affinity groups through empathic, entangled architectural production that cultivates a shared sense of belonging? I'm going to give you just a brief preview of some of the speakers that are to come, and then we'll introduce tonight's speaker. So in the weeks to come, we'll hear from Helena Sandman, who will entice us to design with empathy and to create spaces that support loving connections. We'll hear from Wanda Dalla Costa, who invites us into the affinities of indigenous placekeeping and to mobilize a more pluralistic and participatory approach. We'll hear from Isabel Ndumi, who will contextualize 10 contemporary African architecture practices and dispel prevailing misconceptions about African homogeneity. We'll hear from Deborah Garcia, who will amplify the overlaps of architecture and sound design to initiate a pulsing participatory party. We'll hear from Lola Shepard, who will champion the role of architecture in rural and remote territories where the considerations of environment, geography, colonization, and degrowth become entangled. We'll hear from Andre Haka, who will enact a politics of architecture that is breathed, sweated, swallowed, digested, and climatized. And we'll hear from Matt Stride, who will embrace structure to inform memorable architectural expression. Tonight, I'd like to invite my fantastic colleague, Professor Nilufar Imami, to introduce tonight's speaker.
Good evening, everyone. It is my pleasure to introduce our tonight's lecturer, Brandon Clifford. Brandon Clifford is a time traveler who develops creative approaches to the world's most pressing problems. He identifies contemporary blind spots by mining ancient knowledge that holds resonance with topics of today. Brandon is a director and co-founder of Matter Design and an associate professor at MIT. Brandon received his Master of Architecture from Princeton University and his Bachelor of Science in Architecture from Georgia Tech. In 2011 to 12, he was the Howard E. Lefevre 29 Emerging Practitioner Fellow at the Ohio State University. In 2012, when I started my studies at the University of Michigan, I have been passing by one of Brandon's design projects on a daily basis. It was a coat rack that was placed at the entrance of Michigan's fabrication lab. Later on, I saw the Periscope Foam Tower project in a presentation by Brandon's partner in Matter Design. And that was my personal fascination with stereotomy. And later I was fascinated by his Bowie Stone project, which was showcased at Acadia 2016 project, again held at University of Michigan. I can go on and on and on about how I have been seeing Brandon's projects throughout the last 12 years that I have been in academia. Most recently, we had Brandon graciously agreed to be a keynote lecturer and lead a workshop at LSU where I was teaching before joining here. My fascination with the way that Brandon works with volume and the ways in which he challenges our understanding of material, lightness, and assembly has influenced my personal work. And in the workshop that Brandon led out at LSU, he gave us an insight into his crop circles project. Brandon is a designer and researcher who has received recognition with prizes such as the American Academy in Rome Prize, McDowell Fellowship, a TED Fellowship, the SOM Prize, and the Architectural League Prize for Young Architects and Designers. His most recent authored work, The Cannibal's Cookbook, demonstrates his dedication to bringing ancient knowledge into contemporary practice with theatrical captivation. His work at Matter Design is focused on redirecting architectural research through spectacle and mysticism. Clifford's speculative buildworks continue to disrupt common practices and challenge default solutions. Welcome, Brad.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me, and please take a moment to join me on a journey into prehistory. As Nilüfer mentioned, I started my career in digital fabrication, and a lot of the words that accompany that are like advanced technology, computation, robots, really futuristic thinking, and I was always a little bit disturbed by the sort of work that came out of that field. It was very lightweight, fashion forward, pleated, draped, folded things, lots of surface treatment. And that didn't really jive with what I consider to be the history of architecture as being carved in stone. So I've dedicated my career to exploring some very different ways of thinking about construction from prehistory. Imagine trying to build this today, and if we use all of the paradigms with which architecture operates, where the architect produces a drawing and bids the project to contractors, says, I want it to look like this, and I want it to be custom carved, no mortar, perfect fit, solid stone. How much is it going to cost? Right? How long is it going to take? How much material does it waste? And is it efficient? So the works that I study fail on all fronts to comport with the kinds of questions that we ask of architecture today, particularly from Western society. But yet they exist. This is not the way we build today, because this is how we build today. With the majority of the world's population moving to urban centers, the vast majority of material that's housing that population is being cast out of reinforced concrete, which is not designed to last forever. Far be it, actually. As soon as you place reinforcing or steel into concrete, you establish a mortality date, because that steel will carbonate, and it will decay, and it will collapse in about 150 years. So as we're experiencing the roads and bridges of America collapsing, it's been about 150 years, basically. So this begs the question, what on earth are we going to do with all of this concrete? The default solution is not to recycle concrete. Despite what greenwashing industries tell us, the process of recycling concrete expends a massive amount of energy. And basically what we do is we grind rubble up and we turn it into dust and sand. And we use that as an additive mixture, which is a significantly downgraded aggregate. So the process of recycling concrete is not very future forward thinking. To make matters worse, when you grind that concrete up, you're releasing carbon back into the atmosphere. So recycling's not great. So in the end, what we do is landfill all this rubble. So we're only going to do like 5 minutes of eco-shaming today, by the way, so it's not going to be all downer, like we can relax, but this is what we're doing. The building industry contributes twice as much to landfills as you do as a consumer. And that's what we're doing as architects. We're producing buildings and we're not thinking about the afterlife. What happens to all this concrete? So I'd like to ask the question together with you about how does one incorporate material back into the building stock? In the 1400s, Pope Nicholas V declared that the carcass of the Colosseum should be consumed to produce St. Peter's Basilica. That's where the other half went. Now imagine trying to do this today. Because on one side you're making an argument about sustainability of reusing building materials. And then that's an argument that's being fought against preservationists. Two equally aspirational disciplines fighting it out to figure out what we're going to do with the future of this archaic work. But the Romans are by far the only civilization that recognized the value of considering a building's afterlife. And I return to this image. I will argue, that today's consumer culture is the only culture that has not figured out how to do this. There's a key concept that we need to understand about this wall. This is a polygonal masonry wall at Sacsayhuaman in Cusco, Peru. It's called a polygonal masonry wall because it's made out of polygons. You can find these types of walls all around the world, on Easter Island, in Egypt, in Japan. This happens to be in South America. The Inca and the Quechua cultures were extremely prolific, so you can find incredible examples of this work. If you're in the Mediterranean, that's called Cyclopean masonry, after the myth of Cyclops, the rock-chewing giant that would chew on rocks and construct. It was the kind of like monster that produced architecture. The interesting thing about these walls is that there's no mortar. The way that we think of masonry today is we standardize the building component, whether it's a brick. A brick is designed for a hand to be picked and placed all day long. If you go up to a CMU or a concrete masonry unit, that's designed for two hands to place it. But you'll also notice that the mortar's there. I know I'm speaking to architects. I'm just trying to reinforce some of the things that we all know. Is that mortar is just viscous enough so that the mason can levitate a stone in space for a temporary period of time until that mortar cures and then holds it for not forever, right? So that mortar needs to be replaced. It needs to be dug out and replaced about every 20 years. Otherwise, it will not last. So these have no mortar. They're still standing. As cryptic and baffling as these stone assemblies appear to us today, the key concept that we need to understand is that these stones were not quarried. They were not pre-designed in the way that we think of design today. No one drew an elevation of this wall and then asked a contractor to figure out how to make it. These stones were carefully selected from loose rock falls, or they were cannibalized from previous incarnations of this very architecture. And the intricate details tell the story of how they were made, how they were digested, and how they were reconstructed. So as an approach to a post-extractive future that's on our horizon, I found these methods quite relevant. So what we did as a research group is we analyzed the stones, we traced the elevations, we ran optimization algorithms to understand, when you have larger stones, you get certain types of attributes. When you have smaller stones, you get others. And the other thing that's really important to notice here are the particular angles. So you can see here that this angle will tell you that not only is this stone under that stone, but this stone was certainly set first, and then this one, and then that one, because you can see the angles keep flipping from one side to the other. So we use those angles and those details to decode the mysteries that exist in these stone walls and compiled that into a book that we called the Cannibal's Cookbook. If you're interested in cannibalism and if you want to talk more about that, save that question for the question and answer session, because I would love to talk about cannibalism. But here's the thing that I want to point out today about this book, is that the cryptic character of these walls were not an aesthetic choice. No one set out to design the pattern and then ask someone else to figure out how to make it. So we can't just sit back as designers and say that the construction industry and the salvage industry need to solve this problem for us, because our role is to create buildings, to create representations of architectural intent. The building industry or the construction industry is really dedicated to materializing those drawings. And then once that building's done, we'll leave it to the salvage industry to figure out what's happening. And what I'm trying to say today is that we need to start communicating across these disciplines, because we can't just shirk the responsibility off to the salvage industry. So these are walls that emerged because all of these disciplines were speaking with each other, right? And the methods of how they were made came about because of a finite number of resources, a particular number of tools that are used. These kind of walls exist wherever you find stone tooling construction, no metal cutting. Basically what you have is you have hammer stones that are nibbling away at these larger stones. So that's what produces these really rounded features. So it's more like sanding the stone than it is like cutting. Anytime you're working in that way, you can be incredibly precise, and that's how they're able to get these things to fit quite perfectly. The Inca didn't have a word for cutting stone. Their word translates as nibbling. So they're eating the stone and nibbling away at it. Let's see. So this is one example of the recipe. And in the book, you have these recipes set out. They talk a little bit about the context, which I was just laying out. They describe a lot of the tools and techniques that are used to produce polygonal masonry walls. And then it goes straight into the recipes. And if you follow them step by step, you can reproduce a wall from random bits of rubble. The irony is these are drawings. And in order to produce these walls, you need rubble. So we did that very thing. We took some random rubble and we used this algorithm to produce this wall, which is composed out of some demolished slabs from a Motel 6 in Madison, Wisconsin, and the failed experiments of some of my colleagues at MIT. The offcuts, I can tell you, like this is a stone from William O'Brien Jr.'s work. These darker stones over here are offcuts from Mijin Yoon's Collier Memorial. I won't say that the works are failures, it's just that these particular stones, as they were working them, broke off. So they became rubble. Each one of those bits of rubble are scanned, they're inventoried, they're digitally optimized, and then we apply that Inca algorithm to reassemble this new manifestation. So what I want to identify here is that in order to start building in smarter ways again, we're going to have to reconsider what is and is not to be included in our design process. So designing for salvage in the afterlife is not central to the education of the architect right now. One of the things that we can learn from this exploration is, we're going to look at this a few times today. I think it's a magnificent piece of architecture. Like, these are my researchers, by the way, for scale. When you start thinking about the circularity of building, you shift your values away from certain places that our design process had been dedicated to. You no longer think about efficiency as reducing material use. This is not at all about reducing material use. But the goal of this kind of work, when you're operating under those constraints, is to find the largest possible stone to fill a hole that you have. Right, so that explains the gargantuan size. So if I go back to this diagram here, one of the methods that's used is you have a hole in the wall, and you make a template, and then you carry that template around to all of your random stone inventory, and you try and find the stone that best fits that template, because you want to do the least amount of carving possible, and you only want to move the stone one time, right? Because look at how big they are. They didn't all exist in this state, like they came together in a variety of positions. So the idea of a cyclopean monster that was chewing these things, a lot of the times it's described like, if you look at this, how could humans have possibly built this? So anywhere you go around the world, you find these stories of primordial giants that were used to construct these large walls. So that explains why they were so large, but it doesn't explain how humans could have possibly moved these massive stones. Okay, this is an image of the revered moai of Rapa Nui, or Easter Island. Now this is an image of the quarry. This is the source location with which these moai emerge from the earth. But this is an image of the moai in their final resting position on one of the many ahu platforms that encircle this tiny island in the Pacific. From a Western point of view, we see these as statues. We want to analyze them for their proportions and the stories they tell through their figuration, their placement, and wonder at the idea that there was some artist or some creator who took the time to establish these permanent fixtures, conveying some kind of meaning throughout eternity. But we would be wrong, because this is a far more indicative view of what Rapa Nui culture looked like. This is the backside of an ahu, and just to orient you, almost all of the ahu platforms are around the perimeter of the island. They run parallel to the coast, so the coast is just to the right. The earth is sloping down to the coast, obviously, and because of that, these platforms were built, and there are retaining walls on the backside. The moai face back to the center of the island. So here, we're on the backside of the island. Take note of all the ankle-busting stones. The island is covered in these things. This is what an ahu platform looks like on Rapa Nui. This is what an ahu platform looks like after the Japanese government brings a crane in and reassembles the moai to captivate tourists. So, the fascinating thing about the backside of this ahu, which is on the north side of the island, which you have to take a horse to get to, it's not easily accessible, but if you zoom in on the far right, you'll find a moai buried face first into the thickness of that retaining wall. So, moai are not sacred, they're not eternal, they're not revered artifacts apparently. Maybe they're just a resource, but a stone resource in an island that's absolutely littered with stone, so that doesn't make any sense either. This is a real head scratcher for archaeologists and essentially for Western society. Did the Rapa Nui not value their heritage? Is this some form of conquest? Were they not interested in preserving their history? When the Dutch explorers first encountered the island, they asked the people of Rapa Nui how their ancestors could have possibly moved those massive stones. And the Rapa Nui told them, our ancestors did not move those stones. They said the stones walked themselves. And for centuries, this was dismissed as some form of stone worship. But it turns out that the Rapa Nui were telling the truth, and that the moai were transported standing, pivoting from side to side. Remember, I showed you an image of the one quarry, and there are many ahu platforms. So there's one source location and many destinations. As spectacular as the moai are for visitors today, We have to imagine being there then, at that moment, with colossal moai marching around the island. Because the real memorial is not the objects themselves, as Western society thinks of them as statues that are fixed. The real memorial is the cultural act of bringing a stone to life. So I've been chasing that dream as an architect because it's a very different way of thinking about architecture. I think it's fair to challenge me on whether this is or isn't architecture. But if we equate this to the problem of how did the obelisks of Rome make their way across the Mediterranean Sea and weave their way through the streets of Rome to become erected in the center of the city? This is a problem that requires architecture to move upstream and to think about not only what the building should look like, but to start to think about where the materials are sourced, how the building is designed to be transported, set, and placed. Obviously, these are working with single objects, so we're really thinking of this as a monolith or a megalithic piece of architecture. But the design process is starting to engage in some of those challenges, albeit in a very early stage, right? So I've been challenging myself with this problem. It's a very ancient but straightforward task of just moving and standing big heavy things. Like this 16-foot tall statue that walks across land and stands under the incredibly limited strength of my graduate students. Or this floating stone that swims horizontally under the low bridges of the Charles River and then drinks the river water to stand vertically. It's always the same problem, transporting and standing. It's not an interesting megalith if it's in a quarry. It always has to come from somewhere else, right? Or this 4,000-pound behemoth that springs itself to life to dance on stage. And in testing this problem, we keep making these megaliths, we keep finding different ways of putting on the performance and how exactly is this going to work. This is obviously in the lab, so we're looking at the kinetics and we're measuring things. And you can see that this one's already cracked because it went too far and slammed into the ground once. But clearly we're interested in the perception of life in the object itself, but we're also interested in how humans engage with these inorganic beings. Let's just return to our touchstone for a moment, because this spectacular piece of architecture is composed itself out of megaliths. So now we have to return to the idea that someone was having to figure out how to move and place these big stones. But this goes beyond the moai or the obelisks of Rome. It's no longer just a single object. It raises the stakes into assembly and construction. Somehow we need to levitate stones up higher to be able to set them. Those are already the ones on top are gargantuan stones, right? Let alone the ones that are at the base. So, more recently, we've been asking the question about how we can behave with the assembly so that the objects know exactly how they are to start to collaborate with each other and nestle. And we do this a few times over. And of course, I'm trying to grapple with very different ideas. On one side, there are practical notions of assembly and construction and physics and center of mass, and certain things have to work. The humidity of the space will dramatically change how these things perform, so all of that has to make its way into our computation. To work on things that are well outside of my wheelhouse, that deal with spirituality, ritual, experience, community building. So these are some, we have the hard sciences and the soft sciences that are trying to work together all around just a central design challenge, which is so far away from the way that we think about architecture. I will admit that. But if we think about construction through efficiency, I already talked about how a brick is designed for a mason to pick and place all day long. These kinds of works are efficient in some ways, but they're not efficient in that way. You would never pick up one of these stones and set it and place it, right? You have to apply slow and steady pressure because they have so much inertia, and they really, only behave in the way that they want to behave. So we are calibrating the geometries of the base. You can see that there's a hard line here, so there's a different density of the stone that's down here. These are solid cast concrete elements, but we use that line to drive the center of mass precisely where we need it, which is right there. So that's a calibration hole so that we can pick it up in the lab and see if the center of mass is where we predict it to be. We can pull the center of mass slightly lower, and the piece will stand on its own without human intervention. But these particular pieces were designed to be guided in place by humans. So it's very different than the active labor of picking and placing something. You're collaborating with this piece and you're moving it like a dance partner almost. The first time, it's intuitive, so the first time you start to move them, there are rules to them. They do stop themselves. They have brakes, essentially. But it takes probably about 30 minutes before you start to understand the rhythm of a piece, and then you can start to move it quite fluidly. So that kind of work, because those elements go together, so I'll say relatively easily, they also come apart relatively easily. And the thing that we were very interested in, even though the challenge that we set for that particular demonstration was to figure out how to move and assemble something, we were also very interested in thinking about how we design for multiple states of being and how large concrete elements can give something back to community. This is a project that is in collaboration with the USMC Strategic Alliance, and they are a community programmer at the US-Mexico border at El Paso and Ciudad Juarez. They put on public programs for the community. It straddles both. It has an interesting history, this site where it is, but it's right at the border. And the kinds of events that they put on range in scale from small dinner parties to quinceañeras to massive public speaking events, where they had the Pope come one time and hundreds of thousands of people were on the site. So how do you design a community center that can accommodate this vast range of kinds of programs? And this is what we came up with. It's still a work in progress, so it's an unbuilt project, but I share it with you because those design challenges about how you can transport and place something start to deal with multiple instances of program as well. So it's interested in the kinetics, but it's also interested in semiotics. And the details kind of suggest, it's currently in this configuration, but you understand how these things can be pivoted to nest with other ones. And that was one of the things that I found to be so fascinating about the Inca polygonal masonry walls, is that we are seeing it in just one version of how it existed. It's existed many times over. So there are details that exist in those polygonal walls that don't make any sense and where they're placed at that moment, but they did make sense at some previous incarnation. And I find that to be a fascinating design problem. So at the very same time that we were working on Aki, we were collaborating with a fairly, I would say, radical education group in Radnor, Pennsylvania. They're a progressive education school, middle school and high school students. And they came to us with a fairly straightforward problem of just trying to rethink what play means for middle school students and secondary education. We were talking about this a little bit earlier today, is that play, particularly in America, is commonly, when we use the word play, we're really talking about early childhood. So there are no swing, slides, monkey bars here. These are middle school and high school students that are doing physics experiments, and they're not interested in going down the slide anymore. So the school was interested in the value of play. I mean, it's scientifically proven for them that play is important for creativity and the development, but we just have to think about play differently. So they asked us to collaborate on this play structure. We produced the three colossal elements. These elements have a whole host of riddles that are packed inside of them. So They have celestial alignments. Essentially, we built a prehistoric celestial observatory on this playground site. All of the red elements are things that the students are building in their fabrication space. And the concrete elements have anchors so that you can set standardized components like 2x4s, 2x6s, and 1-inch dowels in them. And that the students, as they go through their education, the curriculum is baked in with all of these challenges. So they're gradually asked to unpack the mysteries that we embedded inside of these objects. And our hope was that students had the same sense of wonder that an archaeologist would have coming across a prehistoric site, trying to unpack exactly what went down here. Now, this is great if you are a student at the Radnor School, at the Grayson School in Radnor. But for all of the other students out there, we were doing a parallel research project that we call the Crop Circle Kit. And it offers string-based computation, all of the rules of what I consider to be the fundamentals of architecture, how you produce a drawing at your desk that can then scale and manifest in the field. Right, so there are certain rules of how geometries can be made. I'll throw a couple of them. The top left one, how do you make two parallel lines in a field? We've got an ellipse in the second right one. And these are fundamentals. Like if I open up Rhino, I can make an ellipse with 3 clicks. But those clicks have absolutely no correspondence to how an ellipse is made with string. So I've been teaching these courses, and as Nilüfer mentioned, on how to introduce. The goal is to work with middle school students, honestly. But I've been teaching these workshops anywhere from middle school up to graduate students, essentially. And the way this works is we sit down at the desk, we learn some of these fundamentals, and then I ask the students to produce a drawing with just string or compass. Next to that drawing, they have to write down all the rules of how someone else would recreate this drawing. And then they would hand the rules to a classmate and have them recreate the drawing and immediately see all of the problems of, I went that way instead of this way, and I need to start talking about direction and communication. I found it to be a wonderful way of teaching computation without touching the computer, because you learn conditional statements, rule sets, procedural methods. And then we had the fun part of going out into a field and making the larger drawings. These are the drawings that were produced in the, it was a weekend workshop at LSU. And there was the large circle. That was the first one that they made. This one here. Certain things, you think a circle is easy, like we're just making a circle, but you can see these light trace construction drawings, and they had to think about how they could get the chalk machine to actually produce lighter lines that they could erase that they didn't need in the end. But the other thing is, like, you realize that maintaining the tension of the string as you're pushing the chalk around is really quite challenging. So you can see that when we get back to that circle, it's really pretty good, and then there's a spot where it gets a little wavy. Like any good crop circle, when you're at the human experience level, you do not see all the discrepancies that exist in the geometry. So then we take a drone up to look down, and they can see exactly how precise they were able to make their drawings. This one here had several errors that are interesting. These are learning experiences, right? There's the wall part right there. Okay, so a couple thousand years ago, Aristotle had a worldview. This was not that long ago. I say a couple thousand years ago because some of the sites that I study are 50,000 years old, so a couple thousand years ago is modern, almost, essentially, relative to these stones. Aristotle had this worldview that there were 2 realms. There's the celestial realm, which is pure, heavenly, and then there's the terrestrial realm, which we live on, and it's profane, it's problematic. The celestial realm begins with the fixed stars, They are the purest possible thing in the universe. They're made of the fifth element, which is ethereal. Aether is the element. They have an ethereal presence. Those stars are constant. They always move in a regular circular pattern. They've been there forever. They will be there forever. They're pure. As you move in from that furthest possible realm of Aristotle's cosmology, you get to planets, which behave a little bit differently. They move across the sky, and then they pause, and they move backwards in retrograde, and then they continue about their way. So the planets are a little bit less pure. And then you have the sun, and then you have the moon. But the idea is that all of those heavenly elements are perfect on crystalline spheres. And then you get down to the terrestrial realm. And can anyone tell me Aristotle had 4 elements that make up the terrestrial realm? I heard water, fire, air, earth, right? So he had these, if you watched, what was it, Power Rangers, or there were all kinds of, like these things, like you say it and we're like, oh yeah, of course, those are the 4 elements, right? So here on earth, we are surrounded by these 4 elements. Earth and rock, those are the densest, dumbest elements that exist. If you drop a rock in water, it falls straight down to the bottom. If you put a bubble of air in water, it goes straight up. If you light a flame, it goes straight up, right? So Aristotle has a fairly rational way of ordering these things. You've got fire at the top, then you've got air, and then you've got water, and then you've got earth under that. Earth is the most profane thing. It is destitute to this space under us. And just, coincidentally, Aristotle has placed humans right in the middle of these 4 elements because we float above water, but we sink in air, right? So once again, humans are at the center of things. But he had a problem because Aristotle taught Alexander the Great, who was going out and conquesting new worlds and sending back reports from his legions of Baemetus that there are rocks falling from the sky. And Aristotle explains this away, and he says, you know what, that's an atmospheric event, like thunder, where some type of energy is happening in our atmosphere, and the thunder occurs, and the rock is falling from the thunder. It's okay, our world is still in its order. So, that's where the term thunderstone was coined, and it was also where the term meteorology was coined. So meteorology means the study of things high up. So then he started producing meteorologists who would measure weather patterns and understand predictions of what was happening in our profane space. That's also why we call meteors meteors, even though they have absolutely nothing to do with one another. So it took some time for Galileo to come around. Galileo was a designer. He was not a scientist or an astronomer. He produced drawings and he published those drawings. He later became known as a scientist. Galileo took his telescope, looked at the moon, and showed that the division between what is light and what is dark is not a straight line, as would be evidenced by a pure crystalline sphere. It actually meandered. And he made a drawing of that moving shadow. And then he waited a month and made another drawing of the shadow being lit from the other side. And he showed that the moon had craters. And he put those in a book called Sidereus Nuncius. And he's essentially saying to the world, the moon is not pure. The moon is a rock, just like the rock that we're on. And we need to think differently. And then he turned his telescope to Jupiter, and he found that there were 3 little dots around Jupiter, and he drew those 3 dots. And then he said, the next night I looked at it again, and those 3 dots moved. And then they moved again, and then there were 4 dots. And he discovered that Jupiter also had moons. And then we get to Kepler and Galileo and the Copernican revolution, and that it took some time for these scientists and designers to be able to understand that we are not at the center of the universe, and we moved from a geocentric to a heliocentric orbit. Sometime later, Michel Mercati, I'm talking about stones. These are all stones that have shattered the way that humans think about the world. So we've got this guy, Michel Mercati, who is the chief curator at the Vatican Museum of Natural History. Right, so he's got a huge collection of fossils and thunderstones and all of these things that have existed in Europe. And then he starts getting objects back from the New World. And some of those objects are hammer stones and flint and arrowheads. And he pulls them next to the thunderstones. And he realizes that the thunderstones are not atmospheric events. They were human-made artifacts that have gradually made their way up out of the earth. And that humans have been on the earth for considerably longer than Scripture had told us. And with that one discovery, we got anthropology and a totally different timeline of humanity. And then we can go to Hutton and Lyell, and we can say that the age of the earth is far older than what Scripture is telling us by many, many magnitudes, because the earth and the rocks in the earth are telling us that they are way older than what we thought they were. We get geology. So one of the interesting things about Aristotle is that the text that we have of Aristotle, it wasn't until the 12th and the 13th century that some very devoutly religious monks were translating these things. Like 1,000 years go by, and just, Aristotle's name is mentioned here or there, and we have some text, little bits of text fragments, and then everything's pulled together into one book that happened closer to us today than it was to Aristotle then, 12th and 13th century. So we have to assume that these monks didn't have some type of motive in the way that they were transcribing these texts. And I would hope that we're at least getting some of the thoughts of what Aristotle had to share with us. But really, I'm dancing around architecture this whole time. I'm talking about astronomy and geology and anthropology and religion a bit. But I haven't yet questioned architecture's origin story, particularly from Western society. Vitruvius, right? Vitruvius was the first author of architecture. That's when history began. So when I say prehistory, I'm talking about anything that was happening before recording that has translated to us today. Even more problematic, Vitruvius wasn't rediscovered until the Renaissance. And Vitruvius was a Roman architect, but the Roman civilization, which is so well known for its record keeping and its taxation and knowing who's making money and who's not making money, has no record of a Vitruvius. So he may have existed. The text may have been true and accurate, but I have a hard time believing that the Carolingian Reformation, which was subsidized by the Catholic Church, took an idea about the origins of architecture and didn't align it with the worldview of people of that day. Right? So then when we get to Loget and the Enlightenment, Loget starts talking about the primitive hut, Vitruvius's primitive hut, that the origin of architecture is in extracting humans from the savagery of nature, a story that aligns so perfectly with the origins of Christianity. So as humans are banished into the savagery of nature, we need to do anything to get out of that. And in the Enlightenment, we were starting to get reports of people in the New World that are coined noble savages. So why is it that we, as a discipline of architecture, have dedicated ourselves to producing buildings with the sole purpose of extracting humans from nature? And at the same time, we're trying to figure out why we haven't been able to reconcile our challenges with climate change. We do two things. We design buildings that humans can go inside of, and we also draw the parking lots and the parking spaces, right? Those are the things that we have held within the domain of architecture. So I'm starting to wonder about how we can start to look at other forms of architecture. These are the challenges that I'm asking myself, and I want to tell you a story which is, it's 50% true, 50% fiction. So you have to live with me a little bit. But this is a very different way of thinking about construction. Imagine a small group of people gathering on a bluff overlooking the Mississippi River. An elaborate construction project is underway, and one by one, members of this community are setting bundles of reed and cane onto the site, lashing and weaving their contribution into this collective nest. There's no foreman, there are no laborers being ordered to pick up the pace. There's no sense of urgency at all. But the sun is setting, and this community will need this fire soon. However, you would not make a fire out of reed and cane to stay warm or to cook food. You only make a fire out of reed and cane for one purpose. And as the sun sets, the structure is lit, and a plume of smoke billows out of this maelstrom of energy, launching a recently deceased member of the community into the heavens to join their ancestors in the Milky Way overhead. This ceremonial cremation is a bridge from life to the afterlife, and it connects Earth to the heavens. But as we're about to learn, the thoughtfulness behind this simple ritual will ultimately live on, spanning inconceivably vast distances and times. As the fire settles, a new performance takes place where baskets of saturated mud are deposited onto the embers, releasing a muffled hiss as the water turns into steam. As each basket is deposited, it's also compacted very tightly, forming an incredibly solid mound, roughly the size of a human. Now, what is the significance of this tiny cremation mound? Well, a couple of things. First, it happened 11,300 years ago. This is in the true part of the story. 11,300 years ago. So that makes this the oldest human-made structure in the Americas that we know of right now. That's 4,000 years before Stonehenge. It predates the Aztec, the Maya, and the Inca. It's truly ancient. But it's tiny, and I like really big things. So why am I focused on this tiny little bump? Because the other thing that's significant about this mound is that the people that created it did not stop here. Because a couple years later, this is also true, after traversing the continent of North America, they somehow navigated their way back to this tiny little bump on the landscape, and they did the ritual again, and again, and again, and they kept that cycle up for another 256 years. Now, keep in mind, 256 years is longer than the United States has existed. That's 10 generations of people. So what would it mean? How would we think as an architect to produce this form, right? Now, if we are only looking for shelter, we cannot define this as architecture. But if we think of it as an act of construction that spans 10 generations, how would you develop a way of constructing that you could convince your children? It's like hard enough to convince your children to do something, let alone their children and for 10 generations. Imagine that. And it's not just a matter of like picking up some mud and setting it and going about your way. The earth that produced this mound is a 5-minute walk down the bluff. And 5 minutes doesn't sound like a lot, but when you account for that distance and the swelling of uncompacted soil, the saturation of that soil, and the assumption that humans carry about 50 pounds all day long, which is quite an assumption, it would take a laborer working nonstop 16 years just to move the earth from site to quarry. So my point is that this mound represents an absurd amount of energy, but the absurdity doesn't stop here, because directly adjacent to this mound is another, almost identical mound, except it's composed of a different kind of earth that comes from a 10-minute walk in the opposite direction. So, explain what that means. Recently, like very recently, an archaeologist at LSU did a core sample. These are at you can go visit these mounds. They're on LSU's campus in Louisiana. He did a core sample and he found at the center, you cannot carbon date earth or rock, but you can carbon date ash. And he found ash at the very bottom that had reed, cane, and what's called mammal matter. And in America, you cannot identify human material, so mammal matter, either they were cremating an animal or they were cremating a human, let's be honest. And then they're able to identify the stratification of how long it would have taken to make this mound, and there are distinct layers of how these were compacted. So this is how these mounds were made. And a little bit of my argument is that if we assume that structure and shelter are the only things that we do as architects, we're missing out on a whole host of ways of thinking about construction from prehistory, because the sites that I explore almost never are intended to shelter humans. They're celestial observatories, they're tombs, they are large-scale landform cremations, and these kinds of sites, for instance, you can find a mound on perfectly due north, another mound. Perfectly due north, another mound that spans states. Cahokia is not too far from here. If you go east, you can go to I highly recommend going to Newark, Ohio, where there are these ginormous ring mounds that are of a scale that's unimaginable. There's one that's a historic site, and then there's another one that's been preserved only because they built a golf course on it. And up until 2 years ago, people were chipping out things from the rough on these prehistoric mounds that are, those are not 11,000 years old. But I'm sorry to tell you, if just a few years ago, if you went to a home game at LSU, you would find people riding inflatable sex dolls down these mounds as ways of at least some kind of ritual is continuing on these sites. I'll give them that. But part of the problem is that we just see them as earth, as dumb earth, and it's the mindset of Aristotle has continued throughout the Middle Ages and into the way that we think about the world today. So I am curious, what kind of architecture might we educate our students on if we were mandating the architect to think about the afterlife of a building instead of the creation of the building? Thank you so much for having me. This has been a lot of fun, and I really appreciate you letting me rant today. So thank you.
We have time for your questions.
First of all, thank you for coming. I do appreciate you giving this lecture. It certainly was interesting because I had not thought about how just stone, something so intricate in the earth, is so important in my world. I was wondering, because especially how can something like mounds, which are very basic to us stones, like something built that is intricately part of the earth. How do I word this? Are there examples that you think are kind of ideal portraits of incorporating kind of, for lack of a better term, trash material or just earth material into our architecture? Because one example that I can think of was like turf houses, like you see, say, Iceland or the Nordics, but that's still kind of semi-artificial, right? Because the turf might be natural, but the house certainly isn't. So, are there examples that are extant that we can see right now, where we are strictly reusing natural materials that have whose shelf life, so to speak.
Yeah. These are the questions I'm asking myself. So like in this, when we get to here, there are more questions than I have answers for, but I do have a few answers for you. One of the reasons why I'm interested in this is because the time scale is so dramatically different than we think of architecture, and I think fundamentally time is one of the missing components that we have in the way that we're thinking about architecture. So much of what we build, we just assume it's permanent. And if you call something semi-permanent, the AIA talks about semi-permanent architecture is 6 years, like 6 years. The average building lasts 30 to 60 years, and that's being quite generous. And as a profession, we've adopted the timeline from the mortgage industry. So the mortgage industry says we will finance buildings with a 30-year timeline. And therefore, the building industry produces materials that have no more than a 30-year lifespan warranty. But usually when we're at our desk and learning the foundations of architecture, the assumption is when you're designing something, there is no termination date to it. So with this, I mean, not only are you thinking, it's like cathedral thinking, where you have to plant the tree for the rafter that's going to decay 200 years from now. That's a different way of thinking about temporality. So one of the things that I've been introducing into my studios at MIT is that we drop some of the presumptions about architecture, like property ownership, that sites are geographically defined boundaries, and that a client comes to us and say, I purchased this land and I want you to design something for this purpose. Instead, we displace site for temporality. And I ask students to design something for 1 day and then for 500 years. And they start to think about how differently you have to design if you think on those different terms. So for me, that's one of the values of these. I'm not necessarily advocating yet, although I said the same thing when I got into megaliths, is that I don't think anyone should be building with megaliths, and then that changed. So this might change as well. But there are some, in America, they're called Indian burial mounds. You can still, they're all over the place. So tens of thousands of these littered across North America. Very rarely were there burials. They're not Indians either. So it's problematic. 2/3 of the term is not right. But they're not always cremation mounds either. This just happens to be a cremation mound. But the ones in Newark are hinges. And the beautiful thing about a hinge is you dig out a circle and you flood that circle with water. Stonehenge also has a hinge. Like we think, when you say Stonehenge, you think of the stones, but there's a hinge beyond it. And the reason that's important is because you can flood that circular drain with water and find a perfectly level alignment to be able to make celestial measurements from. So they were the academic centers. They were the place that you would go to figure out what time is it, what season is it, when is the moon going to be doing this, when's it not going to be doing that. And that's where the most educated people were going in that time. So it's not always such a downer of thinking about a memorial. They did have very active purposes and places where society would gather together. And just because you don't get inside of them, I don't think that means that it's not architecture. So I think that there are so many, like what you would do with a mound going forward. As soon as you start thinking on timelines of, I'm building something for 10,000 years, guess what? You're building a mound, right? So at the same time, architecture is building mounds. We're just not designing them, right? So we're the secondhand product of the buildings that we make. When they get demolished, they get landfilled. And we have civil engineers that are making these things under the premise of efficiency and just packing these things away to be out of sight and out of mind. So when you come across something, think 10,000 years in the future, an archaeologist is definitely going to the landfill because they're able to figure out what people were using at that time. And they're trying to figure out what were people doing with these landfills at our time. That's the legacy that we're leaving. So I could ask the question again. I would love for any one of the architecture students here to go into thinking about, like, how are we actually going to leave that legacy that communicates something? Because this doesn't communicate anything, right? But this does communicate something.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, for the wonderful lecture. I was looking at the projects and the narrative of them, and something struck me that these projects, that the historical precedents that you showed us and your work draws from that, are made by crowds of people over time, as opposed to massive architecture today, which is done by one person at a slice of time. So that outcome has a totally different set.
Yep.
How do you think, or do you have any speculations of how those outcomes can be achieved?
Yeah, I mean, when you think relatively on these terms, the way architecture is practiced today is very fast fashion. It's like boom, boom. Like we're trying to be more efficient. We're trying to design things as quickly as possible and build them as quickly as possible. And there are, I mean, I don't want to be a downer about that. There are many advantages to constructing in that way. We should continue doing that. But it would be a shame that that's the only way that we think about the act of architecture. Because there are very different cultural prisms through which architecture manifests in very different ways. And I'll give you one example. There's a site called Oyate Tambo, which is a moon temple in the Sacred Valley. It's an Inca piece of architecture. But the particular moon temple was designed to have no end date in sight. And why would you ever do that? Because the Inca are the ruling class. So this is the established ruling class of the society. Quechua was the larger culture. And there was no slave practice within this. And you don't get like fine stonework with forced labor, first of all. So the way the Quechua people would pay their taxes to the Inca is that the Inca would establish some type of societal construct. Like society needs a retaining wall here. And you send your best mason from your group and you send your best mason from your group and they come together. And the masons would operate in a way collaboratively where they could leave particular kinds of alignments where they could point out, they could go back and say, I know how to do, this is my secret, I know how to do that. This is proof that our group paid our taxes, right? There came a time at Oyate Tambo when they no longer needed to construct things. And this is a problem that we as architects come across every once in a while. Like for instance, around 2007 in Detroit, architects really needed to be thinking about how to take buildings down, not build new buildings. So what the Inca came up with was a plan for a temple that had no end date in sight, but in order to pay taxes, you could come and work on this temple, which was constantly churning. And it's full of details that have flipped and been reordered. And they had to think about a design process whereby it would just continue to turn itself over and be cannibalized and reincarnated. That, under a particular like post-Enlightenment lens, that feels like a waste of energy, right? But it's communicating a certain idea about architecture that attracts so many people to this site because it's absolutely mystical and miraculous. It makes no logical sense to us because we're looking for something that provides something immediately to society. We have that like immediately, like, can we get our package in 2 days? You know, this is how we think today. So I would love the discipline of architecture to start to do things faster, but also much slower because you end up exercising very different muscles.
Okay, I have one more question. Again, thank you for the lecture and for all the Inca references as a fellow Peruvian. Happy to see that. And on that note, I'm going to take you back to the beginning of your lecture when you talked about Saxon and the image of the walls. And you mentioned that the way that the stones got there and how they were shaped were not designed. Do you understand that? What do you mean by that?
They were not designed in the way that we think of design today. So if we think we want to build a wall, we draw the elevation of that wall, and it's pre-designed, right? We understand where everything goes before you begin. That process was procedural and bottom-up, essentially. And it wasn't based on courses. You start those kinds of walls, is in the Cannibal's Cookbook, you'll find this, but you essentially set one stone here and then go a distance, and you set another stone, and you kind of build around those until they ultimately collapse, and you get really interesting intersections between those two origin locations. And in that respect, they are designed. They are designed, but the design process is very different from the linear process that we think of design today, where design is a drawing. In there, it's a procedural method.
I agree, but I would also disagree. The reason for it is culturally, I think that design for us as a linear method, right, it's a very Western kind of methodology. And I think that to say that we're not designing that they were designed in a sort of process way, right? That is how the culture actually works.
Yes.
I think I agree with what you're saying. It's not linear. There's no drawings, right? Although I could argue that they are drawings, because if you look at some Inca iconography, you will see some of these kind of inner pieces. Something that
Yes.
the images don't show is that behind that entire wall, there a whole engineering section of how these walls interact with each other, the depth of things. But to me, I think it's when we say those things, it's kind of posted within a larger network of saying there's a cultural premise behind there. That linearity for the Incas was never the linear condition that we know of.
Yeah.
Right? There wasn't really years. It was just time, day and night. And I think all of that is really important to mention. For example, the Itaika, which is the largest stone in Saxon, and kind of you mentioned it and you bring it back later on, is the fact that it has a lot of mystical, right? And also the kind of, and perhaps to show it also to notice that how that wall was constructed, the zigzag that it actually has, is a male figure because the female figure is in the back, right? That all mounts in there. So I just want to make that note that although, yes, I agree with you, it's not a linear design, I think there is a kind of cultural design process that might not be beginning to end.
Yeah.
And I know that as you say, it's crucial for that, because the whole point of it was, there was one note to do with the Envision, that was the celebration of the sun, and however that was done at the time, right, was the important part, not really, let's end it, let's begin and end.
Yeah. No, I mean, we're in complete agreement. So when I'm being a bit short about some of these things, but when I say, what I mean to say is that they're not pre-designed in the way that we think of design today. And actually, I think that they're, I hope it's evident in the way that I'm presenting this that I think that is incredibly intelligent, the way that they're able to regurgitate prior versions of architecture, because we can't do that today. So what I'm not putting design, like contemporary design, on a pedestal, because my entire career in digital fabrication has been about saying that the way we design buildings through making drawings and then handing them off to a contractor is ridiculous. And digital fabrication is all about bridging disciplines together so that you can communicate. Like the way things are made and CNC milled, that the designer is directly connected to those things. And I think the kind of interesting thing for me about all of this is that digital fabrication has way more in common with the way that Inca and Quechua culture was building than it has anything to do with modern masters of producing representations of architectural intent. So why we continue to look forward as digital fabricators is absurd to me because we have all these amazing examples from the past. That's what I've been doing with my career. So thanks for the question. I mean, lovely. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Barry, for joining us.